She had nothing, no famous name, no inherited fortune, no seat at the table where men with blood on their cufflinks decided who lived and who didn't. For 6 years, Elena Ashcroft Moretti stood in the shadow of the most feared name in New York and smiled through every insult, every dismissal, every whispered joke made just loud enough for her to hear. They called her decorative. They called her hollow. Damian Moretti's pretty, powerless wife, the woman with empty hands. But empty hands can still hold a knife, and Elena had been sharpening hers for a very long time. If this story already has you hooked, stay with me until the very end, because what happens to Elena will leave you breathless. Hit that like button right now and drop a comment below with the city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The first thing people noticed about the Moretti estate was the silence. Not the comfortable kind. Not the silence of a home where people had learned to rest easy with each other, where the creak of a floorboard at midnight meant someone was getting water, not running. This was a different kind of quiet. The kind that had weight to it. The kind that pressed down on your chest the moment you stepped through the iron gates, and the security camera above the entrance rotated slowly, tracking you like an eye that never blinked. It was a Thursday evening in late October when the grounds crew finished raking the last of the fallen leaves from the stone path that curved from the main gate to the front entrance. The elm trees had gone orange and deep red, and in the dying afternoon light they looked almost beautiful, almost like a painting of a place where people were happy. Elena Moretti stood at the second-floor window and watched the men work. She had one hand pressed flat against the cold glass. Her other hand held a mug of tea that had gone lukewarm 20 minutes ago and that she hadn't bothered to drink. She was wearing a cream-colored blouse and dark slacks, the kind of outfit that read as effortless, understated, put together. The kind of outfit that didn't draw attention, which was the whole point. She had learned a long time ago that the best armor in a house like this was invisibility. She was 31 years old. She had been married to Damian Moretti for 6 years. From downstairs came the sound of voices. Male voices, low and assured, the kind of voices that belonged to men who had never needed to raise them to be heard. She recognized 2 of them, Carlo Accardi, Damian's senior captain, who had a habit of cracking his knuckles before he said something he found clever, and Theo Bassett, the family's head of finance and legal affairs, who smiled too easily at everything and had eyes like a man who was always counting something. The third voice she didn't recognize, which meant it was someone new, someone Damian had brought in. That was the other thing she had learned. When Damian brought in someone new, it was never good news for someone else. She stepped back from the window. The mug went onto the windowsill. She smoothed the front of her blouse once with the flat of her palm, an old habit, barely conscious anymore, and turned toward the door. The hallway outside their bedroom suite was 30 feet of pale marble flooring and framed artwork that Damian had purchased in bulk from a gallery closing in Milan. He had not chosen the pieces himself. He had handed a decorator a figure and told her to make the house look like money. She had succeeded. The paintings were beautiful and impersonal, like everything else in the house, and Elena had long since stopped looking at them. She moved quietly. She always moved quietly. At the top of the stairs, she paused. Below her, in the main sitting room that opened off the entry hall, she could see 3 men arranged in the loose geometry of a business conversation. Not seated, not quite standing, the kind of restless posture men adopted when they were pretending to be casual but were actually measuring each other. Carlo stood near the wet bar, holding a glass that was already half empty. Theo was nearest the fireplace, one hand in the pocket of his jacket. The third man, younger, 30 maybe, with a jaw like a shovel and the kind of stillness that came from military or prison, stood nearest the door. Damian was not in the room yet. Elena watched them for a moment from the top of the stairs. None of them looked up. They never did. She descended. She was 3 steps from the bottom when Carlo glanced over, clocked her, and looked away again, returning to whatever point he'd been mid-sentence on. Theo offered a brief half-nod, the kind you gave to furniture you'd acknowledged before and didn't need to acknowledge again. The younger man didn't react at all. She crossed the sitting room toward the hallway that led to the kitchen. As she passed, she heard Carlo say, not quietly, "He keeps her around because she photographed well." The other 2 laughed. She did not break her stride. She did not change her expression. She went through the door to the hallway, and the sound of their laughter followed her for 3 steps before the thick walls swallowed it. In the kitchen, She set her lukewarm mug in the sink and stood with both hands on the edge of the counter. The kitchen was the one room in the house that felt like it belonged to her. Not because Damien had given it to her. He hadn't, not consciously. It was just that he never came in here, and neither did his men, because the things that happened in kitchens were not the kind of things that interested men like them. But she came in here every morning before the rest of the house woke up, when the light was still gray and thin, and the counters were cold under her hands. And she'd make herself coffee and stand exactly here, in exactly this position, and let herself have 5 minutes of being a person instead of a backdrop. She exhaled slowly through her nose. Photograph well. Right. She had been hearing variations of that for 6 years, and she was still waiting for it to stop landing. Whoops. Damien Moretti came home at 7:14. She heard the front door, heard the particular pattern of his footsteps. Unhurried, deliberate, the walk of a man who had decided long ago that the world would wait for him. And then heard Carlo's voice shift register, becoming slightly more deferential. And she knew without seeing it that Damien had walked into the sitting room and the three men had recalibrated around him like iron filings around a magnet. He came to the kitchen 20 minutes later. She was at the island, going through a stack of correspondence she'd been meaning to sort, mostly letters and documents relating to the Moretti Foundation, the family's charitable arm, which she had quietly taken over management of 18 months ago, when it became clear that the previous manager was siphoning. Nobody had assigned her the job. She'd just started doing it, and nobody had stopped her, and after a while nobody even remembered that someone else had done it before. Damien paused in the doorway. He was 40 years old and looked like what he was. A man who had inherited something and then fought, genuinely and ruthlessly, to keep it and make it larger. He was built along the lines of his family's legacy, broad-shouldered, dark-eyed, with a face that was handsome in the way that expensive suits were handsome, cut sharp and designed to project. He had his mother's jaw and his father's capacity for silence, and the combination made him difficult to read and easy to fear. He looked at her. Then he looked at the papers spread across his kitchen island. What's all this? Foundation correspondence. She didn't look up. The Callaway grant needs a response by Friday, and someone in the development office approved 3 donation requests that I need to review before they go out. Why is that happening in the kitchen? Because I was already in the kitchen. He made a sound that wasn't quite a word and moved to the refrigerator. She heard him open it, heard the clink of a bottle being pulled from the rack. He poured himself something. She heard the glug of liquid into glass. And then he was leaning against the counter across from her, watching her sort through paperwork with the slightly detached expression he wore when he hadn't yet decided whether something was worth his attention. Carlo says the Ramirez family is making moves on the docks again, he said. It wasn't addressed to her specifically. It was more like he was thinking out loud, in her direction, because she was the nearest surface. What kind of moves? She said. He looked at her like she'd said something that surprised him, and then the surprise smoothed out and became something closer to dismissal. Nothing you need to worry about. She pulled a document from the stack, a financial report from one of the foundation's program directors, and said nothing. The Brancusi deal is closing next week, he continued, still not quite talking to her. 30 million in assets, clean. Carlo handled the structure. Theo's running the compliance review. The Brancusi assets include the warehouse properties on the west side, she said. He stopped. She looked up then, calmly. 3 of those properties are currently listed under the Foundation's Community Development Program. If Theo is running a standard compliance review without flagging that, you're going to have a problem when the city audits the charitable filings next spring. Damien stared at her. She held his gaze and waited. How do you know about the Brancusi assets? He said. Because I manage the Foundation's property portfolio, she said. Or I have been, for the last 18 months. I mentioned it to you twice. You were on the phone both times. Something moved through his expression. Not quite embarrassment, not quite irritation, something that lived between them. He set down his glass. I'll have Theo look at it, he said. I already flagged it in a memo to Theo 2 weeks ago, she said. He hasn't responded. She slid the relevant document to the edge of the island, toward him. This is the property index. The 3 addresses are highlighted. He picked it up. He looked at it. She watched him process the information, watched the recognition move through him that this was real, that she had caught something that his expensive legal team had missed, that she had been sitting on this problem in the kitchen, quietly, while his men laughed at her in the sitting room. He set the document down. He picked up his glass. He walked out of the kitchen without saying anything else. She went back to her correspondence. Dinner that night was the four of them, Damien, Elena, Carlo, and Theo, in the formal dining room that she had privately always found oppressive, with its dark wood paneling and its chandelier that hung so low over the table that it always felt like something was descending. The younger man, whose name turned out to be Marcus, though no one bothered introducing him to her directly, she'd caught it from context, did not join them. She wasn't sure if that was because he wasn't yet important enough or because he was already doing something more important. The third possibility, which she filed quietly for later, was that Damien had sent him somewhere on the kind of errand that didn't get discussed at dinner tables. Rosaria, who had been the household cook for 11 years and who was one of the only people in the estate that Elena genuinely liked, served roast chicken with preserved lemon and a winter vegetable gratin. The wine was a Barolo from the cellar, Damien's choice as always. He had a refined palate and used it as a class marker the way other men used cars. To the Brancusi deal, Carlo said, raising his glass, and Theo echoed it, and Damien lifted his glass with the particular contained satisfaction of a man who had just finalized something significant. Elena raised her glass. No one clinked theirs against it. She drank anyway. The conversation moved the way it always did when Damien's men were present, orbiting around him, deferring to him, angling to make themselves appear valuable in his line of sight. Carlo told a story about a problem that had been resolved in Staten Island last week, the details of which were left technically vague, but whose import was clear enough. Theo raised concerns about City Council's upcoming zoning review and what it meant for three of the Moretti family's legitimate real estate holdings. Damien listened, cut through the noise in 3 or 4 sentences each time, and arrived at conclusions that were usually correct. He was not a stupid man. That had never been his problem. Elena ate and listened and said nothing unless addressed, which she wasn't, and watched. She watched the way Carlo's eyes moved when Damien wasn't looking. Quick, calculating, inventory. She watched the way Theo framed every concern as an obstacle that he, personally, was best positioned to solve. She watched the small, careful performance of 2 men who wanted to be indispensable to one man, and she thought about loyalty the way you think about a language you grew up hearing but were never officially taught. "How's the charity work?" Carlo said at some point, in the tone a person uses when they're making conversation with someone they don't take seriously. She looked at him. "Fine," she said. "Good, good." He reached for his wine. "Important to keep the ladies busy." Damien, at the head of the table, did not react. He cut a piece of chicken and ate it and looked out the window at the darkened grounds, where the security lights had come on and turned the trees into flat black shapes against a pale orange glow. Elena set her fork down very precisely on the edge of her plate. "The foundation distributed $4.2 million in community grants last fiscal year," she said, conversationally, like she was describing the weather. "Funded 11 after-school programs across 4 boroughs, 2 medical clinic partnerships, and a job training initiative that placed 63 people in the last 6 months. It also serves as the primary vehicle through which 11 of the family's commercial properties maintain their tax-exempt status under the community benefit provisions in the city code." She picked up her wine glass. "But yes, it keeps me busy." The table was quiet. Carlo looked like he'd bitten into something unexpected. Theo was watching his plate. Damien turned from the window and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, some mixture of things that might have included surprise or might have included something else entirely. And then he picked up his wine and turned back to the window, and the dinner conversation moved on, and nobody addressed her again for the rest of the meal. But she had felt it, that half-second of silence, that small, involuntary recalibration in the room. She took a sip of her Barolo. It was very good wine. The thing about being invisible was that you saw everything. Elena had understood this early, not in the Moretti house specifically, but before, growing up in a family of considerable academic accomplishment and moderate means, where she had been consistently the least dramatic person in any room and had learned to treat that as an advantage rather than a deficit. She had degrees in nonprofit management and financial administration, which sounded dry to the kinds of people who cared about things sounding impressive, and which had turned out to be some of the most practically powerful knowledge she'd ever acquired. You want to understand how an organization actually functions, not how it presents itself, but how it actually moves money and accountability and risk. You follow the nonprofit filings and the grant structures and the board minutes. She had known, within 4 months of marrying Damien, that the Moretti Foundation was a mess, not criminal. That was the thing that surprised her. People assumed, because of what the Moretti name meant in certain circles, that the foundation was necessarily a front, a shell, a laundry operation. But it was something both more mundane and more troubling than that. It was simply neglected. It had been set up years ago, in the early days of Vivian Moretti's effort to give the family's public face a legitimate shine, and it had run on inertia and the occasional oversight of a rotating series of people who understood neither nonprofit management nor the specific complexities of operating under the particular scrutiny that came with the Moretti name. Money had gone to the right places mostly. Paperwork had been filed, mostly, but there were structural problems, the kind that looked small and became catastrophic on the wrong timeline. Elena had started fixing them without announcing it, not because she was strategic, or not only because she was strategic, but because she'd looked at the files and she'd seen the problems, and leaving a problem unfixed when you knew how to fix it had always felt to her like a particular kind of dishonesty, the kind you practiced against yourself. She hired a forensic accountant on a consulting basis, using foundation funds that were legitimately allocated for professional services. She restructured 3 grant programs that had been running with overlapping purposes and reducing overhead. She renegotiated the foundation's relationship with 2 legal firms that had been billing at rates that reflected the family name more than the actual work being done. She flagged 7 instances of irregular allocation over the previous 5 years and quietly corrected 6 of them, documenting everything in memos she sent to the relevant parties and filed in triplicate. The 7th irregular allocation was more complicated because it led somewhere she hadn't expected, and she had been sitting on that particular file for 3 months now, waiting for the right moment. There was always a right moment. You just had to be patient enough to wait for it. She was patient. That was the thing nobody in this house understood about her, because patience in a person who doesn't perform it looks a lot like passivity, looks like acceptance, looks like the thing Carlo had said, that she was there because she photographed well, that she was decorative, that she had nothing to offer but her face and her silence. They saw the silence and thought it was emptiness. They were wrong. 3 days after the dinner with Carlo and Theo, Damien came to find her in the foundation's office. A room on the ground floor that had formerly been a storage room and that she had converted herself over a weekend 2 years ago with flat-pack furniture from a home goods store and decent lighting she'd bought herself and installed with a YouTube tutorial and a screwdriver. Damien had never been in the office before. She was fairly certain he hadn't known it existed in its current form. He stood in the doorway and looked at the filing cabinets, the 2 computer monitors, the framed organizational chart on the wall, and the evidence of a functioning operation, and she could see him updating something in his understanding of the house he lived in. Theo flagged a problem with the Brancusi compliance, he said. She waited. Turns out you were right. 3 of the properties can't transfer clean without a foundation board resolution releasing the community benefit designation. He paused. Theo says we need board approval within 48 hours or the deal timeline collapses. I can convene an emergency board session, she said. I'll need you to sign the authorization and I'll handle the rest. He looked at her. You can do that. I've been chairing the board for 8 months, she said. Nobody told you because nobody thought it was worth mentioning. He absorbed that. He looked around the office again, at the filing cabinets, at the organizational chart, at the evidence of 8 months of work nobody had bothered to report to him. And something moved through his expression that she recognized as a kind of discomfort he didn't have a clean category for. Sign the authorization and I'll have the resolution drafted and the meeting scheduled by end of day, she said. The deal can close on time. He signed. He left. She sat for a moment after he was gone, looking at his signature on the document, and then she picked up her phone and made 3 calls. The board session was scheduled for the next morning. The resolution was drafted in 2 hours. The Brancusi deal closed on schedule. Nobody thanked her. She had not expected them to. The night before the annual Moretti family gathering, the event that Vivian Moretti had instituted 20 years ago, and that functioned simultaneously as a family dinner, a shareholder meeting, and a power display, the kind of gathering that every significant figure in the family's orbit was expected to attend. Elena sat in the small room she thought of as hers and opened the file she'd been sitting on for 3 months. The room was on the second floor, at the end of a corridor that nobody else used. It had been a sitting room once, with a window seat and built-in shelving, and Damien had clearly forgotten it existed. She'd moved a comfortable chair in there 2 years ago, along with a reading lamp and a small table, and it had become the one place in the 30-room house where she could be completely, reliably alone. She opened the file. The irregular allocation she'd flagged was $800,000 that had moved through the Foundation's grant disbursement system 18 months ago, routed to a nonprofit entity in New Jersey that, on paper, provided vocational training to at-risk youth. On paper. In practice, it was a shell, poorly constructed, with the kind of mistakes you made when you were in a hurry and not expecting anyone to look closely, because nobody had ever looked closely before. The money had moved through 3 accounts before ending up in an operating account that she had traced, with considerable patience and a forensic accountant's help, to a name she recognized. Carlo Accardi. She sat with that for a moment. Carlo, who stood at the wet bar and made jokes about women who photographed well. Carlo, who had been Damien's senior captain for 7 years, who sat at the right hand of every important conversation, who had positioned himself so thoroughly inside Damien's orbit that removing him would feel to Damien like cutting off a limb. Carlo, who had been stealing from the foundation that was supposed to legitimize the family name, not from Damien's operational funds. That would have been suicidal, and Carlo was not suicidal, from the foundation, from the charity. The thing nobody watched, except her. She had not yet decided what to do with this. That was the calculation she'd been running for 3 months, not whether to act, but when and how and to what end. Because the naive move, the move of a woman who wanted to prove something, was to bring it to Damien immediately. Look what I found. Look what your man did. And maybe he believed her, and maybe he didn't. And either way, she showed her hand, and Carlo saw her coming and had 3 weeks to build his defense, and she ended up looking like a paranoid outsider trying to destabilize the inner circle. The right move was different. The right move was patience and preparation and timing. She had the documentation. She had the money trail. She had 3 months of careful assembly behind her. She closed the file and sat in her reading lamp's pool of yellow light and listened to the house around her. The distant sound of the television Damien had on in his study, the settling of old walls. And she thought about tomorrow. About Vivian Moretti, arriving in a black car from her house in Connecticut. About the family gathering, with its expensive food and its careful politics, and its room full of men who thought they understood exactly where everyone stood. About the look on Damien's face when she'd produced that document at the kitchen island, the quiet recalibration she'd felt in the room. She thought about the word her mother had used, a long time ago, to describe the difference between the kind of strength that announced itself and the kind that simply remained. Endurance, her mother had said, is not the same as weakness. It's choosing the right moment to be unmistakable. Elena turned off the reading lamp. She went to bed. She slept, which was more than most people in that house managed. The morning of the gathering arrived in cold gray light, and the particular organized chaos that Rosaria always generated when she was cooking for a large party. The kitchen in full production, the smell of braised meat and roasted garlic moving through the ground floor in waves, the sound of catering staff that Damien had hired for the occasion moving back and forth between the kitchen and the formal dining room where the evening's event would be held. Elena was up at 6. She went to her office and worked for 2 hours on Foundation correspondence. She reviewed the quarterly financial report that her accountant had prepared and annotated 3 sections where the numbers needed clarification. She sent 2 emails that had been waiting for responses for 10 days. She made herself coffee in the kitchen at 7:30 before Rosaria's team arrived and stood at the window looking out at the grounds where the morning mist was still low over the grass. At 8, she went upstairs and dressed carefully. She chose a charcoal gray dress that was elegant without being conspicuous. The kind of dress you wore when you wanted to look like you had taste rather than money. The kind of dress that her mother would have recognized immediately. She wore her hair down, which she almost never did, because down it was thick and dark, and fell past her shoulders in a way that changed how people looked at her, even people who thought they were above noticing. She wore simple jewelry, a slim gold chain, small earrings. She looked, she thought, like exactly what she was. A woman who had been underestimated for long enough that she had stopped needing anyone else to correct the error. She came downstairs at 9 to find Damien in the entry hall, adjusting the cuffs of his jacket in the mirror near the door. He looked up when she appeared on the stairs, and she watched the 2-second calibration that happened in his eyes, the same look she'd caught at the kitchen island, the same involuntary updating. And then he looked away. "My mother's arriving at noon," he said. "I know," she said. "I organized the guest room on the 3rd floor for her, the one with the east-facing window, because that's the one she prefers. I also arranged for her preferred tea to be stocked and for Rosaria to have the walnut tart she likes for after dinner." A pause. "She told you she prefers that room?" "She mentioned it the last time she visited 2 years ago. I kept the note." He looked at her again. That expression again. Something she couldn't fully name, something with too many layers to it. And she wasn't sure all the layers were good, but she held his gaze without flinching until he turned and walked back toward his study, and the sound of his footsteps faded down the corridor. She stood in the entry hall alone. She exhaled once. She checked the time. 3 hours until Vivian Moretti arrived. 3 hours to remain exactly who she was, in exactly the way she'd been, waiting for the room to change around her. She walked back to her office. She sat at her desk. She opened the file with Carlo's name on it, and she read through it one more time. Not because she needed to, but because she wanted the facts clean and precise in her mind, every figure and date and account number exactly where she'd put it, so that when the moment came and she believed it was coming, she would not hesitate. She would not be dramatic about it. She would simply be right. The file went into the inside pocket of her blazer. The fine wool one, charcoal gray to match the dress. The one with the deep interior pockets. She'd had a tailor ad because she'd never understood why women's clothing was designed to carry nothing. She closed the office. She went to make sure the guest room on the 3rd floor was ready. It was. She had made sure of it 2 days ago. She stood at the window of Vivian's room and looked down at the driveway where, in 3 hours, a black car would arrive, and the only person in this house who had ever frightened Damien Moretti in any consistent way would step out onto the stone path and walk through the iron door. Elena had met Vivian Moretti 4 times. At the wedding, at 2 family gatherings, and once, briefly, at a foundation board meeting that Vivian had attended because she was technically the foundation's founding patron, even if she'd long since stepped back from active involvement. At that meeting, 18 months ago, Vivian had sat at the far end of the table and said very little, and at the end, when the other board members had filed out, she had looked at Elena for a long moment with the gray eyes that Damien had inherited and said, "You found the problems in the annual report. It was not a question." "Yes," Elena had said. "How long ago?" 4 months. "And you haven't told Damien?" "Not yet." Vivian had looked at her for another long moment, and then she'd gathered her things and stood, and as she moved past Elena's chair, she said, very quietly, so that there was no way the remaining staff in the room could have heard it, "Good girl. Wait for the right moment." She hadn't said anything else. She'd walked out. Elena had sat in the boardroom after she left and thought about what that meant. Whether it meant anything, whether it was an observation or an encouragement or simply a passing comment from a woman who had seen a great deal and was in the habit of acknowledging competence when she found it. She had decided, after a while, that it didn't matter which it was. What mattered was that someone in this family had looked at her and seen the right thing. The black car would arrive in 3 hours. And something. Elena could feel it the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm, the way the light shifts and the birds go quiet. Something tonight was going to be different. She didn't know yet exactly what shape it would take, but she had the file in her pocket, and she was very good at waiting. The gathering began at 7. By 8, the formal dining room held 22 people, family, captains, the heads of 4 Moretti-adjacent business operations, 2 lawyers, and 3 individuals whose specific function Elena had never been able to precisely identify, but who appeared at every gathering and always sat near the exits. The wine was exceptional. The food was what Rosaria produced when she was given a full day and adequate staff, which was to say it was remarkable. The conversations in the room formed the usual overlapping architecture of performance and negotiation, and Elena moved through them with the practiced fluency of someone who had learned to be charming in exactly the way that didn't require you to say anything of consequence. Vivian Moretti had arrived at noon, precisely as expected, in the black car. She was 68, and she moved with the unhurried authority of a woman who had decided sometime in her late 40s that she would never again be in a hurry for anything. She was silver-haired and sharp-eyed and impeccably dressed, and when Elena had met her at the door, she had looked at her. A single, complete look, top to bottom, not unkind, more like assessment, and then said, "You're wearing the dress I would have chosen." Elena had said, "Your room is ready. I had the east-facing one prepared." Vivian had smiled with half her mouth. "Of course you did." At dinner, Vivian sat at the opposite end of the table from Damien, as she always did, and the two of them conducted a conversation across 22 people in 12 feet of distance that had the particular character of a chess game being played in public. Exchanges that seemed innocuous and were not. Silences that meant things. The occasional remark that landed with the specific weight of something that had been planned. It was 9:40 when Vivian set down her fork. She did not reach for her wine. She did not excuse herself. She simply set down her fork with a precision that in another person would have been unremarkable, but which in Vivian Moretti was, Elena understood, something closer to a signal. The room did not go quiet immediately. Quieted in waves. The nearest conversations first, then the ones further down the table, the sound dying away like water finding its level, until 22 people were sitting in the kind of attentive silence that you produced when Vivian Moretti looked like she was about to say something. She looked at her son. "Damien," she said. Her voice carried without effort, the voice of a woman who had never needed amplification. "I'd like to say something." Damien set down his own wine glass with the careful control of a man who was not sure what was coming and had decided not to let that show. "Of course," he said. Vivian looked around the table, at Carlo, who was mid-reach for the bread and had stilled with his hand in the air, at Theo, who was sitting very straight, at the captains and the lawyers and the men whose function Elena had never identified, who were watching Vivian with the absolute attention of people who understood that things of consequence happened when this woman spoke. And then, only then, Vivian looked at Elena. Something in her expression settled. She looked back at her son, and she began to speak. What Vivian said that night, in the formal dining room of the Moretti estate, before 22 witnesses and a table still set with the remains of an exceptional dinner, what she said changed everything, but it was what she pulled from her jacket pocket, unfolding it slowly and deliberately while the room held its breath, that would make Carlo Accardi's face go the color of old ash. And it was what Elena felt in the inside pocket of her own blazer, the file, the documentation, the 3 months of patient assembly, that told her, with complete and sudden clarity, that the right moment had arrived. It had arrived, and she was exactly ready for it. Vivian Moretti did not unfold the document dramatically. That was the thing Elena would remember later, the absence of theater in it. Vivian simply reached into the interior pocket of her jacket, a movement as unhurried as reaching for reading glasses, and produced a folded set of papers and laid them on the table in front of her with the flat final sound of something being placed rather than thrown. 22 people stared at those papers. Damien's jaw tightened by a fraction. "I've spent the last 4 months," Vivian said, "reviewing the family's financial picture, not the operational accounts, not the things Theo manages." She paused. "The foundation, the charitable programs, the legal business structure that keeps this family's name appearing in donor lists and community reports rather than federal indictments." Carlo put down the bread he'd been reaching for. He put it down carefully, like a man trying not to make noise. "What I found," Vivian continued, "was interesting." She let that word sit. She looked at Damien. "It was interesting because most of what I found, I didn't find. Someone had already found it. Someone had already documented it, corrected 5 of 7 structural violations, and flagged the remaining 2 in memos that went unanswered." She looked down the table, at Elena. "My daughter-in-law," Vivian said, "has been running the Moretti Foundation's legitimate operations for 18 months without a title, without compensation beyond what she was already owed as a family member, and without telling a single person in this room that she was doing it." The silence in the dining room had a texture to it now. Elena could feel it against her skin, the quality of attention that 22 people produced when they were holding very still. "She also," Vivian said, and here her voice did not change in volume or in pace, but something in it sharpened to a point, identified an irregular disbursement of $800,000 that moved through the Foundation's grant system 18 months ago and ended in an account that does not belong to any legitimate program. She looked at Carlo. Carlo looked back at her. His face had not gone pale yet. That came later, in stages. But something behind his eyes had shifted, the way something shifts in an animal that has just recognized it's been surrounded and is in the process of calculating the exits. "The documentation," Vivian said, "is in front of me, and I understand there is a more complete version of it in this room." She was not looking at Elena when she said it, but Elena felt it like a hand on her shoulder. Elena reached into the pocket of her blazer. She placed her file on the table. She did not stand. She did not announce herself. She simply put the file on the table and slid it, one smooth, unhurried motion, toward the center, where anyone at the table could reach it. The room looked at the file. The room looked at her. And then, for the first time in 6 years of dinners and gatherings and events in this house, 22 people looked at Elena Moretti and saw something they had not accounted for. Damien said nothing for 11 seconds. She counted them because she had learned over 6 years to read the shape of his silences, what they contained, how long they would last, what came after them. This one had a particular quality. It was the silence of a man who was very intelligent, rapidly processing information that required him to update several things at once, and who did not want anyone in the room to see the updating in progress. "Carlo," he said finally. His voice was even, completely even, in the way that a surface is even when someone has spent effort making it so. Carlo said, "Damien, don't." One word, not raised, not theatrical, just final, in the way that a door closing is final. "Not here." Carlo closed his mouth. Vivian watched her son with the expression of a woman who had been waiting a long time for a particular conversation and was not yet sure whether it was going to be the right one. "We'll continue this privately," Damien said, looking around the table with the controlled authority of a man reasserting the perimeter of his own room. "Tonight, after dinner." "After dinner," Vivian said, and she said it pleasantly, with the particular pleasantness of a woman who had already won the point and did not need to belabor it. The dinner resumed. It resumed in the way that things resume after a detonation in a public space, the mechanical continuation of normal behavior while everyone in the room was still processing what had just happened, recalibrating, exchanging looks that tried to look like they weren't exchanging looks. Rosaria's staff came and went with the next course, and wine was poured, and somewhere down the table a conversation restarted about the zoning review, and it was all enormously, perfectly normal, and absolutely no one was fooled. Elena ate her food. She was very calm, the kind of calm that lived on the other side of a long preparation, when there was nothing left to prepare and the only thing remaining was to be present for what happened next. Across the table, 3 seats down, she could see Carlo's hands on the tablecloth. He was holding very still. The private meeting happened at 10:30 in Damien's study. Damien had chosen the study deliberately, his space, his desk, his bookshelves full of things that projected a particular version of himself. The study was where he conducted serious conversations, and Elena had been inside it perhaps a dozen times in 6 years, almost always to bring him something he'd asked for and then leave. Tonight, he had asked her to stay. That alone, the fact of the request, delivered quietly as the guests were dispersing, his hand briefly on her arm in the hallway, stay, after, told her something had shifted. She was not sure yet how far. The 4 of them in the study, Damien behind the desk, which was where he always positioned himself when he wanted the architecture of the room to do work for him. Vivian in the leather chair to the left of the fireplace, which was not on offer, but which she had occupied without asking, the way she occupied every room she entered, Carlo standing near the door. And Elena, and this was deliberate, she chose the position deliberately, standing neither near Damien nor near Vivian, but against the bookshelf on the right side of the room, equidistant, belonging to neither side, watching all 3. Damien put the file on his desk. He opened it. He read for approximately 90 seconds, which was long enough to absorb the key figures and short enough that she knew he had already seen something similar from Vivian's version. He closed the file. He looked at Carlo. "Explain it," he said. Carlo had spent the last hour. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, in the particular way his hands had stilled, constructing something, an explanation, a narrative that could survive the room. He was not a stupid man either, which was the thing that made him dangerous as opposed to merely inconvenient. It was a bridge transaction, Carlo said. The money was always going to come back. There was a timing issue with stop. Damien's voice still had that evenness, that terrible evenness. I said explain it, not construct it. There's a difference. Carlo's jaw moved. The money went to my account, he said. The flatness of the admission cost him something visible. It was supposed to be temporary. The NJ entity was a vehicle I set up to hold it while a real estate deal closed. The plan was to return the funds through a reclassification before the next audit cycle. Whose real estate deal? Vivian said. A beat. Mine, Carlo said. And the Moretti Foundation's $800,000, Vivian said, with the patience of someone leading a witness who has already lost, was collateral for your personal real estate investment. Silence. Yes, Carlo said. The word landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Damien stood up. He walked to the window. He stood there with his back to the room, looking out at the grounds where the security lights made the lawn look sterile and blue-white. And he stood there long enough that Elena could hear his breathing, slow, controlled, the breathing of a man who was performing control because the alternative was unacceptable. When he turned back, his face was arranged. Get out of my house, he said. Carlo started to speak. Get out, Damien said. And this time there was something under the evenness, something that was not quite sound, more like pressure, the way the air changes before something structural gives way. Carlo left. The study door closed. The three of them, Damien, Vivian, Elena, remained. The silence after Carlo left had a completely different quality than the silence during dinner. That one had been public, performative in the way that all silences in front of an audience were performative. This one was private, which meant it was honest, which meant it was more uncomfortable. Damien looked at his mother. You've been investigating the foundation for 4 months, he said. Not an accusation, more like a statement that he needed to hear himself say. I have. You didn't tell me. No. Why? Vivian tilted her head slightly, the gesture she used when she found a question either naive or predictable. Because I needed to know what I would find, she said, before I knew who I could tell it to. Damien's mouth tightened. And her, he said. And he did look at Elena then, directly, for the first time since the dining room. You knew about her, before tonight. I suspected she was competent, Vivian said. Tonight confirmed it. You could have told me, he said, about any of it. The foundation, the work she was doing, She was doing the work without asking permission, Vivian said. If I had announced it to you first, you would have given her a title and a budget and supervision and turned something she was doing correctly into something you were managing, and then it would have been your accomplishment instead of hers. She paused. I've seen you do it before. You don't always know you're doing it. Damien said nothing. He looked at Elena. She held his gaze. She did not help him. She had learned that there was a particular kind of unhelpfulness that was, in the end, the most honest thing you could offer. The space to arrive at something without being led. The second violation, he said. The one you didn't correct. Carlo's disbursement, she said. Yes. You've had documentation on that for 3 months. Yes. And you sat on it. I sat on it, she agreed. He let out a breath through his nose. It was not quite a laugh and not quite frustration, somewhere between them. Why, he said. If you had brought this to me 3 months ago, 3 months ago, she said, you would have handled it privately. Carlo would have repaid the funds quietly under whatever arrangement you constructed between you, and it would never have been addressed structurally, and it would have happened again with someone else, to something else, the foundation, or something adjacent to it, or something worse. She paused, then said carefully, you would have protected him, because he's been useful, and because you've known him for 15 years, and because protecting people who've been useful is what you do, even when you shouldn't. The room was very quiet. I needed it to happen here, she continued, where it couldn't be managed quietly, where the people who needed to understand the scope of the problem would understand it. Damien stared at her. She could see him recalibrating again, that same motion she'd watched at the kitchen island, in the dining room, in the hallway. But this time it was larger, slower, like something more foundational was being shifted. Vivian, from the leather chair, said nothing. She was watching her son with a patience that Elena recognized now as something inherited, the patience of a woman who had waited a very long time for a great many things and had learned to distinguish between the waiting that was useful and the waiting that was just postponement. "There's something else," Elena said. Damien's expression did not change. He had gone still in the way he went still when he was genuinely uncertain what was coming, and she recognized it because it was one of the few times in 6 years she'd seen it. Carlo wasn't the only person receiving foundation funds through irregular channels, she said. His was the largest and the clumsiest, which is why I found it first. But there are 2 others. Smaller amounts, better constructed. One of them has been running for 3 years. She produced 2 pages from the back of the file. She had kept them separate precisely for this moment, the moment after Carlo, the moment when the room had recalibrated around his departure and was ready to hear what else existed. She placed them on the desk. Damien looked at the names on the pages. She watched his face. The second name was Theo Bassett. Theo was not in the study. Theo had left with the other guests, saying his measured, professional goodbyes in the entry hall, the same half-smile, the same easy handshake, the man who was always counting something counting his way out the door. Damien sat down behind his desk. He looked at the page for a long time. "Theo," he said finally. 3 years, Elena said. The amounts are smaller, spread across 6 different program accounts, all in the range that wouldn't trigger automatic review. But the pattern is consistent and the destination accounts are connected. To what? To a holding company in Delaware that I traced through 2 layers of incorporation. The company has 2 directors. She paused. Theo is one. The other is a name I don't recognize, Marcus Vale, which may be relevant, given that there was a man named Marcus at the house earlier this week. Damien went very still. Vivian's eyes sharpened. "The young man you brought in," Elena said, keeping her voice level, descriptive, not accusatory. "I don't know his last name, but the name on the Delaware Incorporation is Marcus Vale, and the company has been active for 3.5 years, which predates Carlo's disbursement by 2 years. Which means," Vivian said, and she said it quietly, the way you said something quietly when you were working through the implication and wanted to hear it out loud, "that Carlo may have been improvising, but whatever Theo is doing, he planned." The study was very quiet. Outside the window, a security light flickered once and steadied. Damien put both hands flat on the desk. Elena looked at him. At the set of his jaw, the controlled tension across his shoulders, the expression of a man who was processing the specific and particular pain of discovering that the people he had trusted most were not the people he thought he knew. And she felt something that surprised her by arriving. Not satisfaction, not vindication, but something closer to sorrow. The clean, honest sorrow of watching someone understand something true that should have been understood earlier, and knowing that some of the delay was your own fault, and some of it wasn't, and that the distinction mattered less than the cost. "What do you need?" he said. She understood what he was asking. Not what do you need from me in the transactional sense. What do you need to do what you've been doing? What do you need that you haven't been given? Authorization to conduct a full audit of the Foundation's accounts going back 5 years, she said. Official board authorization, not informal permission. My name on the documentation as Director of Operations, so that when I make requests of financial institutions and program partners, I'm doing it with legal standing and not on a handshake. He reached for a pen. "I'll have Theo prepare—" He stopped. A pause. "I'll have the family's outside counsel prepare the authorization documents," he corrected himself. She nodded. "And I need you to understand," she said, "that when the audit is complete, there will be more. Not necessarily more theft, though there may be, but more structural problems, more places where the Foundation has been used carelessly, more evidence of the gap between what this family presents publicly and what it actually is." She waited a beat. "I can fix the fixable things, but you have to be willing to hear what isn't fixable, and to act on it." Damien looked at 6 years. 6 years of dinners where she'd sat beside him and been invisible. 6 years of events where his men had looked through her. 6 years of being the woman with empty hands, decorative, unremarkable, the quiet wife in a loud house. He looked at her, and she let him look, because she was done making it easy for him to look away. "All right," he said. It was not an apology. She had not asked for one, and she would not have trusted one, not yet. not without the understanding that it needed to be followed by something other than words. But it was acknowledgement, and acknowledgement was a start. And she had learned a long time ago to be realistic about what a start could carry. Vivian stood up from the leather chair. She was putting on her jacket, the unhurried movement of a woman who had accomplished what she came to accomplish and was now free to leave, which was its own kind of power. She paused near Elena on her way to the door. She did not say anything remarkable. She said, "I'll want coffee in the morning, early, before the house wakes up." Elena said, "I'll be in the kitchen at 6. Vivian looked at her with those gray eyes, the same eyes as her son, but carrying 30 years more of whatever it was that experience did to eyes. And she nodded once and walked out. The study door closed behind her. Damien and Elena were alone. I was still sitting at the desk, his hands still flat on the surface, looking at the 2 pages. Carlo, Theo, the Delaware Company, the 3.5 years of quiet, careful construction. And she could see the weight of it on him, not just as a professional problem, not just as a security failure, but as the particular weight of betrayal, which was different from other kinds of problems because it required you to revise your understanding of the past, not just the present. "You should have told me," he said, and he was not talking about the foundation anymore, not entirely. She considered that. "Maybe," she said, "but I wasn't sure for a long time that you would have listened." He absorbed that without deflection, which was something. She left him in the study. She went upstairs. She was at her bedroom door when she heard it. A sound from somewhere below, not in the house, outside, near the south gate of the grounds, where the security cameras covered the service road. A single, compressed sound, there and then absent. The kind of sound you told yourself was a branch or a settling wall, because the alternative was something you were not prepared to address in the middle of a night that had already cost enough. She stood at the bedroom door for 3 seconds. She turned back toward the stairs. She found the security guard, Petro, in the monitoring room off the main corridor, watching the screens with the half-alert posture of a man 3 hours into a night shift. "The south gate," she said. "Pull the last 5 minutes." Petro looked at her, looked with the brief surprise of a man who had never been given instructions by her before, had never thought of her as someone who gave instructions. And then he turned to the screen and pulled the footage. They watched it together. The south gate camera, 11:07 p.m., the service road empty. Then, movement at the far edge of the frame near the tree line. Not a branch, not a settling wall. A figure moving with the careful deliberateness of someone who knew exactly where the camera's range ended and was staying just outside it. And then the figure stopped and seemed to look directly at the camera from the edge of the darkness for one long, specific moment, then was gone. Petro said slowly, "That's not one of ours." Elena looked at the empty frame where the figure had been and felt the cold settle into the back of her neck. Not fear, not exactly, but the recognition of something that had just become real in a new way, the recognition that the evening's events had not gone unnoticed by people outside the house, and that someone had been watching, and that the distance between the gathering tonight and whatever came next had just collapsed to almost nothing. "Lock the south gate and increase the patrol rotation," she said, "and wake Damien." Petro made the call to Damien at 11:14 p.m. Elena stood in the monitoring room and listened to the one-sided conversation through the half-open door of the study. Heard Damien's voice shift register within 2 sentences. Heard the specific quality of silence that followed Petro's description of the footage, and then heard the sound of a chair being pushed back and footsteps moving with a purpose that was different from the purpose they'd moved with an hour ago. He came into the monitoring room still buttoning his cuff. He looked at the frozen frame on the screen, the empty tree line, the service road, the precise edge of darkness where the figure had stood, and he looked at it for exactly as long as he needed to before he looked at Petro. "Rewind to when they first appear," he said. "Full speed." They watched it again. The figure at the tree line moved with a trained stillness that was its own kind of information. Not nervous, not rushed, the movement of someone executing a task rather than acting on impulse. Whoever it was had known the camera's range, had known the patrol schedule well enough to appear in the gap between rotations, had stood there long enough to make the point, "I was here, I know where you are," and then left. "How long between patrols at the south gate?" Damien said. 18 minutes, Petro said. "Standard rotation." "Move it to 10. Stagger the intervals so there's no predictable gap." He looked at Elena. This started tonight. Yes, she said, which means someone was watching the house during the gathering, which means they knew who was here and what kind of conversation was happening. Or they already knew something was going to happen tonight, she said carefully, and they were confirming it. Damien held her gaze for a moment. Theo, he said, or whoever Theo has been working with, Marcus Vale. The Delaware company has been active for 3.5 years. That's not a reaction to tonight. That's infrastructure. Whatever Theo built, he built it while he was still sitting at your table, and someone has been patient enough to wait for the right fracture point. And tonight, Damien said, was the fracture point. A public confrontation, Carlo gone. The foundation's problems exposed. From the outside, this house looks exactly like it does when a family's about to split. She paused, which is when other families move. He was already reaching for his phone. The next 3 hours were the kind of hours that left marks. Damien worked the phones from the study while Elena sat at the monitoring room's secondary screen and pulled every piece of documentation she had on Theo Bassett's financial activity. Not just the foundation records, but the broader picture she'd been assembling peripherally for months. The way you assembled peripheral things when you'd learned to trust your own instincts about what mattered even before you could articulate why. What she had was not complete. It was never complete. But it was enough to begin constructing the shape of what Theo had been building, and the shape, once she could see it, was worse than she'd expected. The Delaware company, Vale Bassett Holdings, which was the full name she found on the third layer of the incorporation documents, had interests in 4 of the Moretti family's legitimate real estate partnerships, not direct ownership. Something more careful. Minority positions in the holding entities that themselves held the real estate. Positions that would be functionally invisible in a standard financial review, and that had been acquired incrementally, over 3 years, at prices that were always just reasonable enough not to trigger suspicion. Theo had been buying into the Moretti legitimate business structure from the inside, not stealing from it, buying into it, piece by small piece, through vehicles that Theo himself had structured and that Damien had signed without knowing what he was signing, because Theo was the one who prepared what Damien signed, and Damien had trusted him the way you trusted someone who had been competent for 7 years and had never given you a reason not to. The distinction between stealing and acquiring was important. Stealing left you with money. Acquiring, done right, left you with ownership. At some point, and she could not tell yet exactly when, but the structure suggested within the next 18 months, Vale Bassett Holdings would have accumulated enough minority positions that a coordinated legal challenge to the family's control of its legitimate business portfolio was not just possible, but viable. Not a hostile takeover in any dramatic sense. Something quieter and harder to fight. A minority shareholder dispute, filed through legitimate legal channels, backed by 3.5 years of carefully documented ownership. Theo would not be stealing the Moretti empire. He would be arguing in court that he already partially owned it. She sat back in the chair and looked at what she'd assembled on the screen and felt something cold move through her that was not fear and not anger, but was the specific sensation of understanding something at its full scale for the first time, when you'd previously only seen the edges. She printed the summary. She took it to the study. Damien was on the phone. He held up one finger without looking at her, finished the call, set down the phone, and looked at what she put in front of him. He read it in silence. When he finished, he read it again. He was going to take us to court, he said. Through the legitimate business structure, yes, which is the one structure where you can't respond the way you'd normally respond. It's designed specifically to be untouchable by anything outside the legal process. Damien pushed back from the desk. He stood and walked to the window, and Elena watched the back of him, the set of his shoulders, the tension visible even through the jacket, and understood that he was in the process of something that didn't have a clean name. Not just anger. The thing underneath anger. The thing that anger was the surface expression of. The specific devastation of having been comprehensively, intelligently, patiently deceived by someone you had chosen to trust. 7 years, he said. She said nothing. 7 years he's been at this table. He turned around. His face was arranged, but the arrangement was costing him. You found this in one evening. I've been looking at the foundation records for 18 months, she said. Tonight gave me the connection I was missing. The Delaware company's name, the Marcus Vale piece. She paused. I didn't know the full shape of it until tonight either. He moved back to the desk. He picked up the phone. He made a call she didn't hear the details of. She gave him privacy, stepping back into the corridor. And when he came to the door, his face had changed again, settled into something that was harder and more closed. The face he wore when a decision had been made and the making of it was finished. "I need Theo in this house tomorrow morning," he said, "before he hears about tonight from anyone else." "He may already have heard," she said. "If Marcus Vale was at the South Gate at 11, Theo may have been expecting a call. Then I need him before he acts on what he's heard." He looked at her. "Can you be here?" The question surprised her. Not the content of it, the form of it. In 6 years, he had not asked her to be present for anything operational. He had not asked her to be present for anything, really. Things happened around her and she was there or she wasn't, and her presence had never been factored into the calculation. "Yes," she said. He nodded. She went to bed at 2:15. She did not sleep. Theo arrived at 8:45 the next morning. He arrived in his own car, which was itself information. He hadn't sent a driver, hadn't arrived with the extra beat of formality that would have signaled he was preparing for a confrontation. He came the way he always came, efficient, prompt, composed, carrying a leather portfolio and wearing a jacket that fit well, and projecting the particular confidence of a man who had decided on his way over how this conversation would go. He was 3 steps into the entry hall when he saw Elena. She was standing to the right of the staircase, near the door to the sitting room, and she was simply standing there, not blocking the way, not positioned aggressively, just present, with the stillness she'd cultivated over years of being in rooms where she wasn't the expected variable. Theo looked at her. Something moved across his face and was gone in under a second. A recalculation. The adjustment you made when a room contained something you hadn't planned for. "Elena," he said pleasantly, "is Damien—" "He's in the study," she said. "He's expecting you." Theo walked past her. She followed. The study had 3 people in it when Theo entered. Damien behind the desk, a man named Vincent Carew, who was the family's outside counsel, and who had the rangy, unhurried presence of someone who had spent 40 years in rooms where things went wrong and had learned to be the calmest thing in any of them. And Vivian, again in the leather chair by the fireplace, because Vivian had not left the previous night after all. She had taken her room on the 3rd floor, and she had come down at 6 and found Elena in the kitchen as agreed, and they had drunk coffee together in the gray morning light and not said very much, and what they had said had been enough. Theo looked at the room. He looked at Vincent Carew. He looked at Vivian. He looked at Elena, who had come through the door behind him and taken a position near the bookshelf. The same position as the night before, equidistant, belonging to neither camp. "Sit down, Theo," Damien said. Theo sat down. He placed the leather portfolio on his knee. He did not open it. Damien put 3 documents on the desk and turned them so they faced Theo. "Vale Bassett Holdings," Damien said. "Tell me about it." Theo looked at the documents. He looked at them for the right amount of time. Not too long, not the look of surprise, not the look of a man who'd been caught. The look of a man reading something familiar and deciding how to characterize it. That, Elena thought, was the tell. The absence of shock. The immediate move to characterization rather than reaction. "It's a private investment vehicle," Theo said. "I have minority positions in several real estate partnerships as a personal investment. There's no prohibition on that under my agreement with the family. The positions are held through an entity that shares a director with a man named Marcus Vale," Damien said, "who was on my property last week." A pause. "Marcus is a business associate," Theo said. "The connection is professional." "What kind of professional?" "Real estate advisory." Damien looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "You've been my head of finance and legal affairs for 7 years. In that capacity, you've prepared, structured, and recommended every significant transaction involving the family's legitimate business portfolio." He picked up one of the documents. 3 of the partnerships in which Vale Bassett holds minority positions were structured by you on behalf of this family during that period. Theo said nothing. "You structured them," Damien said, "and then you bought into them, through a vehicle that obscures your name behind one layer of incorporation." "The positions were acquired at fair market value," Theo said, "through legitimate—" "Stop." Damien's voice had not risen once. Elena had been listening for it, and it had not risen once, which was more frightening, she thought, than if it had. I'm not talking about legality right now. I'm talking about what you did. The room was silent. Vincent Carew made a small note on the legal pad in front of him. I made investments, Theo said. Long-term investments in assets I knew were undervalued because I was in the position to know that. That's not... It's a conflict of interest, Elena said. Everyone looked at her. She said it again, simply, without heat. It's a textbook conflict of interest. You had a fiduciary duty to this family's business interests. You used the knowledge and access that duty gave you to make personal investments in the same assets. That's the definition of a breach of fiduciary duty, and in the context of a legal challenge, which is what the accumulated minority positions are eventually designed to enable, it's also potentially fraud. Theo looked at her. For the first time since he'd walked into the house, his composure showed a crack. Not collapse, just a crack. The kind you saw when someone had prepared for every variable in the room except the one that was speaking. You don't have the standing to, he started. She does, actually, Vincent Carew said mildly. As of this morning, she's the authorized director of operations for the Moretti Foundation, with legal standing to act on the family's behalf in matters related to the foundation's financial interests. I prepared the documentation last night. He turned the legal pad so Theo could see it. The foundation holds indirect interests in 2 of the 3 partnerships you mentioned. That makes this very much her concern. Theo closed his mouth. He looked at the legal pad. He looked at Damien. And something in his face shifted. The composure didn't collapse. It restructured, reorganized itself into something that was not quite what it had been, something with a different quality underneath it. And Elena recognized that quality because she had been watching people recalculate in this house for 6 years, and she knew what it looked like when someone moved from defending to deciding. He was deciding something. She felt it before she could articulate it. A prickling at the back of her neck, a change in the air of the room, the specific tension that preceded a move she hadn't anticipated. Theo opened the leather portfolio. He removed a single document and placed it on the desk in front of Damien. Before this goes any further, he said, and his voice had changed, quieter, more deliberate, the voice of a man who had decided to play a different card entirely. You should see this. Damien looked at the document. Elena watched his face. She watched the blood drain out of it. She could not see the document from where she stood. She stayed where she was, her training, her instinct, the 6 years of learning to hold position, and she watched Damien read whatever was on that page, and she watched what happened to his face while he read it. And what happened to his face was the worst thing she had seen in this house. Not anger, not shock. Something more fundamental than either. The look of a man reading something that recontextualized a very large section of his life. Vincent Carew leaned forward and looked at the document. His expression did not change, but his pen stopped moving. Damien set the document down. He looked at Theo. "Where did you get this?" he said. His voice was very quiet now, a different kind of quiet from before. "It's been in my files for 2 years, Theo said. I've never used it. I want you to understand that. I've had it for 2 years and I've never used it, because it was always leverage of last resort. I'm showing it to you now because I want this conversation to end before it becomes something that can't be undone." "What is it?" Elena said. Damien looked at her. She held his gaze and waited. He picked up the document and walked it across the room to her. She read it. It took her 40 seconds, and in those 40 seconds, the architecture of everything she thought she understood shifted on its foundations in a way that left her standing in the same position, but inhabiting a completely different room. The document was a wire transfer record. The transfer was for $4.7 million, moved 11 years ago from an account in the name of a holding company called Ashcroft Klein Capital to an account that she recognized, because she had spent 18 months inside the Moretti Foundation's financial records as one of the foundation's predecessor accounts, established by Vivian Moretti in the early years of the family's legitimization effort. Ashcroft Klein Capital. Her mother's maiden name was Ashcroft. Her father's name was Gerald Klein. She read the document again. Her eyes moved over the figures, the account numbers, the date. 11 years ago, which was 5 years before she met Damien, which was a timeline that could not be coincidence and which had, in the space of 40 seconds, rewritten every story she had told herself about how she came to be standing in this house. She looked up. Vivian was watching her from the leather chair with an expression Elena had never seen on her face before. Something that was not quite guilt, and not quite apology, and not quite explanation, but that contained elements of all three. The expression of a woman who had been waiting for a particular moment and had not known, until it arrived, exactly what it would cost. "Vivian," Elena said. The name came out of her like something structural giving way. Vivian said, "Sit down, Elena. Tell me what this is." "Sit down. Tell me what this is." Her voice was not raised. It was, if anything, quieter than before. The quiet of something under enormous pressure. The quiet of water, just before it finds the fracture in the wall. "My parents' company transferred $4.7 million to the Moretti Foundation 11 years ago. Before I knew Damien existed, before I knew any of you existed." She looked at Vivian. "Why?" Vivian looked at her for a long moment with those gray eyes. "Because your parents came to me," she said. "Your father's company was in trouble. Not the kind of trouble you fixed with a bank loan. The kind of trouble you fixed by finding someone who understood how to make problems disappear cleanly. He'd made a series of decisions that left him exposed to people who were not going to wait for repayment." She paused. "I helped him. The foundation was the vehicle because it was clean and because it gave him a legitimate record of the transaction. In exchange, he agreed to a future arrangement, the terms of which were left unspecified at the time." The room was absolutely silent. Elena heard her own breathing. "The unspecified arrangement," she said. Vivian's expression did not flinch. "Was you," Vivian said. "Not in any coercive sense. Your father never knew the specifics, and you were introduced to Damien through channels that seemed coincidental because I made them seem coincidental. But I identified you 2 years before you met him. I read everything your father's company had, I read your academic record, I read your professional history, and I determined that you were exactly what this family needed and that the circumstances existed to make a meeting possible." The floor did not move. Elena was certain of that, intellectually certain, and yet something in her body was responding as though it had. "You arranged it," she said. "I facilitated conditions. You arranged my marriage." "I arranged an introduction," Vivian said, and there was a precision in the correction that was its own kind of cruelty, the precision of a woman who had lived her whole life in the space between what was technically true and what was real. "What happened after was genuine. What you built was genuine. Everything you've done in this house, every problem you've found and fixed, every document you've assembled, none of that was arranged. That was you." Elena looked at the wire transfer record in her hand. She looked at the date. 11 years ago. She looked at the amount. 4.7 million. She thought about her father, who had died 6 years ago, a year after her wedding, of a heart attack that the doctors had attributed to chronic stress, and who had sat at her wedding with an expression she had read at the time as happiness, and was now revising into something she did not have a clean word for. She thought about what it meant to be chosen. What it meant to be chosen specifically, deliberately, as a piece in someone else's arrangement, and to have spent 6 years believing you had found your own way into a room. She put the wire transfer record on the desk. She did not look at Damien. She was not ready to look at Damien. She looked at Theo. "This changes nothing about what you did," she said. Her voice had steadied, not because she was steady, but because she had learned over a very long time to make her voice do what she needed it to do regardless of what was happening underneath. "The conflict of interest exists. The breach of fiduciary duty exists. The veil beset positions exist. What happened 11 years ago has no bearing on any of that." Theo looked at her with something that was almost respect. "I know," he said, "but it changes the conversation, and I think we both know that." "What do you want?" Damien said. He had not moved from the desk. He had not looked at his mother since Vivian had spoken. I was looking at a point on the surface of the desk, and Elena could see what it was costing him to hold himself in place. The specific, enormous effort of a man who had just heard 2 things he could not unhear and who was deciding which one to feel first. "I want out," Theo said. "Clean. The position's unwound at the acquisition price. No penalties, no legal action, no other consequences. In exchange, I walk away from the organization entirely. The Delaware company is dissolved, and Marcus Vale has no further contact with anything related to the Moretti family interests." "And if I say no," Damien said, "then the document goes to people who will find it considerably more interesting than you did," Theo said. And the questions it raises about how Elena came to be in this house become questions that are asked in a much less private setting. The room waited. Elena looked at Damien. He looked up from the desk. He looked at her. Not the recalibrating look, not the assessing look, but something rawer than either. The look of a man who was standing in the rubble of several things at once and trying to find which piece to pick up first. She held his gaze. "No," she said. Everyone looked at her. "The answer is no," she said to Theo. "You don't get a clean exit, not because of the money. The money is recoverable, because of what you built and who you built it with. Marcus Vale has been in contact with at least one rival family. I know that because the Delaware company's address appears in a set of correspondence I found 3 weeks ago in the Foundation's unprocessed mail. Correspondence addressed to a name connected to the Ramirez operation." She watched Theo's face carefully. "You didn't just build a legal challenge, you built a back channel. And if the Ramirez family knows that this family is fractured tonight, the threat is not a court filing. The threat is something that comes through that south gate with considerably less patience than the man who stood there last night." The silence that followed was the longest of the evening. Theo's composure, which had survived everything else, developed a second crack and did not close it. "The correspondence," he said carefully. "You have it." "I have it," she said. She did not have all of it. She had 2 pages of it, found by accident in an unprocessed mail batch, enough to see the connection and not enough to see the full picture. But Theo did not know what she had and what she didn't, and the gap between those 2 things was right now the only leverage she had left. She looked at Damien. "You need to call Ramirez," she said. "Tonight. Not tomorrow. Tonight. Because if Theo tipped them that this house was fracturing and they've been waiting for that signal, you have hours, not days, before someone decides the moment is right." Damien picked up his phone. He looked at Theo. "You're staying here," he said, "until I know exactly what you told them and when." Theo looked at the door. He looked at Vincent Carew. He looked at Elena. And in his face, in the careful, composed, 7 years practiced face of a man who had built something patient and long and had watched it come apart in a single morning, she saw the precise moment when he understood that the woman he had spent 7 years ignoring was the reason he was not walking out of this room on his own terms. Damien stepped into the corridor to make the call. Elena stood in the study with the wire transfer record on the desk in front of her, and Vivian in the leather chair, and Theo held in place by the gravity of everything he'd set in motion. And she understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that the ground she'd been standing on for 6 years had been chosen for her before she arrived, and that the life she'd believed she had built on it was both entirely her own and not what she'd thought it was, and that she was going to have to decide, in the next several hours, which of those 2 things was the more important truth. Outside, somewhere beyond the south gate, the morning was bright and cold, and the Ramirez family was either waiting or already moving, and the window between those 2 possibilities was closing with every second that Damien stood in the corridor with a phone pressed to his ear, and Elena Moretti, the woman with empty hands, the woman who photographed well, the woman who had been placed in this house like a piece on a board before she ever knew the game existed, stood in the wreckage of what she thought she knew and prepared to do the only thing she had ever actually known how to do. She prepared to be exactly what was needed, in exactly the moment that required it, regardless of the cost. The phone call in the corridor ended. Damien came back through the door. His face told her everything she needed to know before he spoke a word, and what it told her was that they were out of time. Damien said 4 words. "Ramirez is already moving." He said it from this doorway of the study with the phone still in his hand and his face carrying the particular blankness of a man who had just heard something that required him to compress several hours of processing into several seconds, because several hours was what they did not have. Elena looked at him. "How far?" she said. "Victor Ramirez made 3 calls in the last hour. My contact at the Port Authority picked up movement on 2 of the Moretti warehouse leases. Someone requesting access records, building schematics. Not a break-in, a preparation." He came fully into the room. "They're not coming tonight, they're mapping tonight." "Which means they move in the next 48 hours, Vincent Carew said. He had not raised his voice once since arriving, and he did not raise it now. "When the mapping is complete and the positions are confirmed." 48 is generous, Elena said. "If Theo's contact passed information last night after the South Gate, They already have a significant amount of the mapping done. The request for building schematics is the final layer. She looked at Theo. Which properties did you give them? Theo said nothing. Theo. Damien's voice had the quality of something that had stopped performing patience. Which properties? I didn't give them properties, Theo said. I gave them a structural overview. The legitimate portfolio, the key assets, the warehouses, Elena said. A pause that was its own answer. The Brancusi properties, she said. The ones that just transferred. The ones where the community benefit designation was just released, which means there's a period of 45 days before the new ownership is fully registered, during which the chain of legal control is ambiguous. She felt it come together in her mind the way pieces came together when you'd had them separately long enough. The Brancusi deal, the timing, the property index she'd put on the kitchen island 3 days ago. They're going to make a move on the warehouse properties during the registration gap. Not a violent move, a legal one, first. File a claim on the ambiguous title, create enough noise to freeze the assets, and then use the frozen assets as leverage while they reposition operationally. Operationally meaning what? Vincent Carew said. Meaning the legal challenge is the distraction. It ties up Damien's attention and resources in court filings and injunctions while the actual move happens somewhere else. She looked at Damien. What else transferred in the Brancusi deal? Not the warehouses. What else? Damien crossed to the desk. He pulled open the bottom drawer and removed a folder she recognized. The Brancusi transaction file, the one Theo had prepared. And he opened it and ran his finger down the asset list. He stopped. He looked up. The Meridian building, he said. She knew the Meridian. Everyone in the family knew the Meridian. A 12-story commercial building in Midtown that was the most visible single asset in the Moretti legitimate portfolio, the building that appeared in the background of every piece of press coverage about the family's business interests, the building whose address was on the foundation's letterhead, whose lobby had the family name on the wall in brushed steel letters. The Meridian transferred in the Brancusi deal, Damien said, 3 weeks ago. Registration pending. Registration pending, she said, during which the title is in the same ambiguous status as the warehouses. She looked at Theo. They're not going for the warehouses. The warehouses are the noise. They're going for the Meridian. The room was very still. If they file a title claim on the Meridian during the registration gap, Vincent Carew said slowly, and if they can demonstrate a basis for the claim, even a weak one, they can get an emergency injunction freezing the asset within 72 hours. At which point the Moretti name is on the front page of every business paper in the city attached to a disputed title claim, and every legitimate business partner, every bank, every city agency with a relationship to the family's legal interests starts making calls about exposure. And the family's credit position collapses, Elena said. Not the operational finances. The legitimate business structure. The thing Vivian built. The thing the foundation depends on. The thing that keeps this family's name in donor reports instead of federal indictments. She looked at Damien. That's the move. That's what 3.5 years of patient positioning was building toward. Damien closed the folder. He looked at Theo with an expression that had gone beyond anger into something colder and more durable, something that would outlast the immediate emergency and still be there in the morning. Get him out of my sight, he said to Vincent Carew. Keep him here, but get him out of my sight. Vincent Carew stood, gathered his legal pad, and placed a hand briefly on Theo's shoulder, not gently, with the firm directing pressure of someone moving a problem from one location to another. Theo went. The door closed. Damien looked at Elena. Vivian, from the leather chair, had not moved. Tell me what you need, Damien said. What she needed took 40 minutes to organize and required 3 phone calls she made herself, from the study, with Damien sitting across the desk from her and Vivian standing at the window watching the grounds with her arms crossed, a posture that Elena had decided meant she was thinking rather than waiting. The first call was to the family's title insurance company. She spoke to a senior underwriter she had developed a relationship with over the foundation's property transactions, and she explained in precise and technical language that the Brancusi transfer assets were potentially subject to a predatory title challenge during the registration gap, and she requested an emergency endorsement that would allow an expedited registration process. The underwriter said 48 hours. She said she needed 24. The underwriter said he would see what he could do, and she said she needed more than that, and she explained carefully exactly why, and the underwriter said he would make the calls. The second call was to a contact at the city's Department of Buildings, a woman named Sandra Park, who had processed 3 of the foundation's community development applications over the past year, and who owed Elena, in the informal but very real economy of professional favors, a significant return. Elena explained the situation with the warehouse properties and asked for an administrative hold on the access request that had been filed at the Port Authority, pending verification of the requesting party's standing. Sandra Park was quiet for a moment and then said she'd need a formal request. Elena said she would have it to her within the hour. She hung up and drafted the request herself from memory, citing the relevant administrative code sections without looking them up, because she had read them enough times that they lived in her head as cleanly as her own name. The third call was the one she had been turning over in her mind since Damien said Ramirez is already moving. She made it without explaining it first, and she felt Damien watching her across the desk as she dialed, watching with the particular attention of a man who had decided sometime in the last hour that he was going to follow her lead until he understood what the lead was, because following her lead was the first functional decision he'd made in the last 12 hours. The phone rang 3 times. A woman answered. "This is Elena Moretti," she said. "I need to speak with Victor Ramirez." Damien went very still. Vivian turned from the window. There was a pause on the line, a longer pause. Then a man's voice, unhurried, the voice of someone in his 60s who had learned to treat urgency as a performance rather than a state. "Mrs. Moretti," Victor Ramirez said, "I wasn't expecting your call." "I know," she said. "That's why I'm making it, but..." She did not put the call on speaker. She held the phone to her ear and kept her voice level, and she said what she had decided to say, which was not what Damien would have said, which was not a threat or a challenge, or the opening move of a negotiation designed to demonstrate strength. What she said was the truth, stated plainly, in the particular register of someone who is done performing and is offering the other party the same courtesy. She said, "You've been given information about this family's situation that is accurate in its details and wrong in its conclusion. The situation you were told represents instability. It doesn't. What happened last night was the removal of 2 compromised individuals from positions they had been misusing. The family's legitimate assets are intact, the management structure is being reinforced, and the title challenges you're planning to file will be met with an expedited registration that closes the window before your legal team can execute. You will spend money and time on a filing that gets dismissed, and in doing so, you will have made an enemy of a family that had no particular interest in being your enemy before this week." A silence on the line. "That's a very calm assessment," Victor Ramirez said. "I'm a calm person," she said. "Your husband is also on the property, I assume?" "He is. And he's comfortable with you making this call." She looked at Damien across the desk. He held her gaze and gave a single, small nod. "Yes," she said. Another silence. Longer, this time. She could hear something in the background, the ambient sound of a large house, voices at a distance, the muffled sound of a television. "The information I was given," Ramirez said carefully, suggested the Moretti organization was entering a period of significant internal restructuring, that the legitimate business assets would be subject to a period of contested management. That information came from a man who no longer works for this organization and who was providing it in exchange for his own exit arrangement, Elena said, which should tell you something about the quality of the analysis. A beat. "Theo Bassett," Ramirez said. Not a question. "He's currently in this house," she said. "If you'd like confirmation of his current employment status, you're welcome to call him." A sound that might have been a dry laugh. "Mrs. Moretti," Ramirez said, "you understand I can't simply stand down based on a phone call." "I understand that," she said. "I'm not asking you to stand down. I'm asking you to wait 72 hours. In 72 hours, the Meridian registration is complete, the warehouse titles are clean, and the window Theo sold you doesn't exist anymore. At which point you're looking at a straightforward calculation. The cost of a legal challenge that won't succeed versus the value of a relationship with a family that is now considerably better organized than it was a week ago." She let that sit. "And if I don't wait," Ramirez said, "then we spend the next 18 months in court and in the street and neither of us comes out of it well," she said. "And the people who benefit are the ones who aren't in the fight." The silence this time was different. She could feel the calculation happening in it. Not the calculation of a man who had been talked out of something, but the calculation of a man who was revising his assessment of the situation he had walked into. 72 hours, he said. 72 hours, she confirmed. I'll be watching the registration filings, he said. I'd expect nothing less, she said. She ended the call. She put the phone on the desk. Damien was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face in 6 years of living in the same house, and she recognized it, after a moment, as something close to awe. The awe of a person watching someone do something that they could not have done themselves, and knowing it, and being unable to perform otherwise. 72 hours, he said. Can we actually close the registration in 72 hours? I don't know, she said honestly. The underwriter is making calls. Sandra Park is filing the administrative hold. If both of those move at the speed I've asked them to move, we have a chance. She paused. But we need to work through the night. Both registrations require documentation I have to pull from the foundation files, and 2 of the Brancusi property records have errors in the chain of title that I found 6 weeks ago and flagged, and that nobody corrected, and I need those corrections before the expedited registration can process. Tell me what you need, he said again. I need you out of the way, she said. I need the study, the foundation files, and Rosaria to make coffee every 2 hours. I need Vincent Carew available by phone, and I need you to make sure Theo stays in this house and stays quiet, because if he makes contact with Ramirez before the 72 hours are up and tells him the registration can't close in time, we lose the window. Damien stood up. He came around the desk. He stopped in front of her close enough that she could see the exhaustion in his face. The real exhaustion, not the performed composure. The actual cost of the last 16 hours written in the lines around his eyes and the set of his jaw. The thing Vivian told you, he said, about how you came to be here. She looked at him. Not now, she said. I know, He stopped, started again. I didn't know. I need you to know that I didn't know. She looked at his face. She believed him. Not because she was inclined to trust him. 6 years had given her a realistic rather than generous assessment of him, but because the thing Vivian had described was not the kind of arrangement a son would know about. It was the kind of arrangement a mother made in the background of a son's life, in the spaces he never looked into because they weren't his to look into. I know, she said. He nodded once. He stepped back. He walked to the door, and before he went through it, he stopped and looked at Vivian, who had remained at the window through the entire call with Ramirez, and who had not spoken once. What passed between them in that look was not something Elena could fully read. It was the compressed language of a specific relationship, the language of a mother and son who had spent decades in a house full of things unsaid. But she saw Vivian hold his gaze without flinching, and she saw Damien absorb whatever was in it, and she saw him walk out. Vivian turned to Elena. I should have told you, she said. Yes, Elena said. I will tell you everything when this is finished. Yes, Elena said again. You will. She sat down at the desk. She opened the foundation files. She began to work. The next 19 hours were the longest Elena had been through since the years of her father's financial crisis, which she had been 20 years old for and had watched from the outside, understanding enough to be frightened and not enough to help, and which had left her with a specific and lasting relationship to the sensation of events moving faster than she could process them and the necessity of processing them anyway. She worked through the night. Rosaria brought coffee at 2 and at 4 and at 6, setting the cups down on the corner of the desk without speaking, which was the particular grace of someone who understood what working looked like and knew when silence was the most useful thing to offer. Vincent Carew was available by phone and earned whatever the family paid him 3 times over in the space of those 19 hours, pulling precedents, drafting correction filings, interpreting administrative code in real time, while Elena read the relevant sections to him from the files spread across the desk. He had been practicing real estate and corporate law in New York for 40 years, and he did not waste words, which she found deeply restoring. At 3 in the morning, she found the second title error in the Brancusi chain. Not the one she'd flagged 6 weeks ago, but a new one, deeper in the documentation, a gap in a 2019 conveyance record that had been papered over with an assumption rather than a corrected filing, the kind of error that happened when transactions moved fast, and nobody went back to check. It took her an hour and a half and 2 calls to a records archive to reconstruct the correct chain. She did not stop for anything during that hour and a half, except to drink the coffee Rosaria had left, and to roll her neck twice when the tension became a thing she could feel in the base of her skull. At 4:45, she sent Vincent Carew the corrected documentation package. At 5:30, he confirmed it was complete. At 6:15, the title underwriter called to say the expedited endorsement was approved. At 7, the administrative hold on the warehouse access records was confirmed by Sandra Park, who sounded like someone who had also not slept, and who Elena made a mental note to send something to, not flowers, something more useful, something that acknowledged the specific kind of professional courtesy that had just been extended. She pushed back from the desk at 7:20. She sat for a moment in the study with her hands in her lap, and the morning light coming through the window at a low golden angle that made the room look peaceful, which was not what it was. Damien came in at 7:30. He looked at her, at the files spread across his desk, at the empty coffee cups, at the fact of her sitting there in the same clothes she'd worn to dinner the previous night, and the particular quality of stillness that settled over a person who had been working very hard for a very long time and had just stopped. He sat in the chair across the desk. "The registration package is with the underwriter," she said. "Vincent has the correction filings. If everything processes on schedule, we close inside 60 hours. Inside the 72. Inside the 72. He was quiet for a moment. "Theo talked," he said. 2 o'clock this morning. Not to Ramirez, to someone in the Ramirez organization. A call he made from a phone he had in his jacket that we didn't find when we checked him." He paused. "The call lasted 4 minutes. We don't know what he said." She absorbed that. "Which means Ramirez may know the registration is in progress," she said, "and may move to counter it before the 60 hours are up. My contact at the Port Authority says there's been no new activity on the warehouse requests, and the Meridian building is quiet. For now," she said. "For now," he agreed. She looked at him across the desk, across the files, across the years, across the wire transfer record that was still sitting where she'd placed it the night before, slightly to the left of the Brancusi folder, a rectangle of paper that had rewritten something she thought she understood about the life she was living. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Ask." "If Theo's call got to Ramirez, if Ramirez decides the 60 hours is too long to wait, if someone comes through that south gate tonight with something other than patience," she held his gaze, "are the men you have on this property enough?" He did not answer immediately, which was its own answer. "I made calls last night," he said. "Reinforced the gate rotation. Brought in 4 additional men from the Brooklyn operation. The estate is as secure as I can make it in 12 hours. "That's not what I asked." He looked at her steadily. "No," he said. "If Ramirez commits to a full move on the property, what I have here is not enough. I have enough to hold for a while, not enough to hold indefinitely." She nodded. "Then we need the 60 hours," she said, "and we need Theo to not make another call. Theo is currently in the East Wing with 2 men outside the door." "Does he still have the phone?" A pause. "We took the jacket," Damien said. "We may have missed—" She was already standing. "Check him again," she said. "Now, everything, every pocket, every seam, and move him to the basement. The East Wing has windows." He was already moving. She followed him into the corridor, and they went quickly. Not running, because running in a house full of people who were watching for the signal that things had moved from tense to critical would have been its own kind of announcement, but fast, with the purposeful pace of 2 people who had arrived at the same understanding of what the next several minutes required. They were at the East Wing door when they heard it. Not a shot. She had been in this house long enough to know that what a shot sounded like at distance was not what the movies suggested. It was smaller, flatter, more ordinary, the sound of a thing rather than an event. What she heard was different. A concussive impact from the south end of the property, followed 2 seconds later by the sound of the security panel in the corridor going to alert. The rapid, insistent tone that meant a perimeter breach, not a sensor error. Damien had his phone out before the second tone. Petro's voice from the monitoring room. "South gate, vehicle breach. They're on the grounds." Elena felt the cold hit the back of her neck. Not fear, not panic. Something sharper and more functional. The acute clarity that arrived when the thing you had been preparing for arrived, and preparation met reality, and the gap between them had to be closed in real time. "How many?" Damien said into the phone. Petro said something she couldn't hear from where she stood. Damien's face told her. He looked at her. 8, he said. At least. He pushed open the east wing door. Theo was inside, sitting on the edge of the room's single chair, and in his hand was a phone. Not a jacket phone, a backup. The kind of backup you carried when you'd been in enough rooms where things went wrong to know that one phone was never enough. And the phone was in his hand, but the call was already ended. The screen already dark. The 4 minutes, or the 2 minutes, or however long it had taken already spent. Damien crossed the room in 3 steps. He took the phone. He looked at the call log. He looked at Theo. And Elena, standing in the doorway of the east wing with the security panel still sounding its alert down the corridor, and 8 people moving through the south end of the Moretti estate grounds, and 60 hours still remaining on the window she had bought with a phone call and a night without sleep, understood with complete and terrible clarity that whatever happened in the next several hours was not going to be resolved with documentation or phone calls or the patient assembly of facts. She looked at Damien's back, the set of it, the held tension of a man who was at the edge of the last thing he had. And she made the decision before she fully articulated it to herself. The way decisions were made when there was no time for anything but instinct, and what instinct had to draw on was everything you'd ever prepared. She walked to the monitoring room. She sat down next to Petro. She looked at the screens, all 12 of them, the full perimeter, the grounds lit harsh and blue-white under the security floods. And on the south side screens the movement of figures that were not her figures, moving with the trained, coordinated pace of people who had done this before. And she put her hand on the desk, and she leaned forward, and she began to think. Because the men coming through the south gate were a problem that Damien's 4 additional men and his reinforced rotation were not going to solve alone. And she had 60 hours in a Ramirez organization that was betting she didn't know how to use them. And she had one thing that Victor Ramirez did not know she had. One conversation, one piece of information Theo had let slip when she'd confronted him about the Delaware company. One name that had appeared in the correspondence she'd found in the unprocessed Foundation mail that was not the Ramirez name and was not Marcus Vale's name, but was a third name, a name that represented a relationship the Ramirez organization had spent 3 years hiding from the Moretti family for reasons that she now understood completely, and which was, in the right hands, in the right moment, the single piece of leverage that could stop 8 men on the south grounds without a shot being fired. She picked up the monitoring room phone. She dialed the number she had memorized from the correspondence 2 weeks ago and told herself she was saving for the right moment, and the right moment had just arrived wearing the face of a crisis. And she was ready for it, and she was terrified, and she dialed anyway, because terrified had never once stopped her from doing what needed to be done. The line rang once, twice. Someone picked up. The person who picked up did not say hello. They said, in a voice that was low and careful and very controlled, "Who is this?" "My name is Elena Moretti," she said. "I'm calling about a name that appears in correspondence between Theo Bassett and the Ramirez organization. A name that connects the Ramirez family to a set of financial relationships they have spent considerable effort keeping separate from their public dealings." She paused. "The name is Daniel Cho, and I think you know why I'm calling." Silence on the line. Not the silence of someone who didn't know the name. The silence of someone who knew it very well. "Where did you get that name?" the voice said. "From documents in my possession," she said. "Documents that become considerably more or less dangerous to a number of people depending on what happens on the south grounds of the Moretti estate in the next 20 minutes. Another silence. Shorter. "How many men do you have on those grounds?" the voice said. She understood then that she was talking to someone inside the Ramirez operation. Not Victor Ramirez himself, but someone close enough to him that they knew about Daniel Cho and understood what the name meant and had the authority to make a call. "Enough," she said, "but I'm not interested in what happens if they engage. I'm interested in what happens if they don't have to." A breath on the line. "Give me 4 minutes," the voice said. "You have 3, she said. "After 3, I make a different call." She did not know who the different call would be to, but the voice on the line did not know that, and 3 minutes was what she needed, and she held the phone against her ear and watched the screens and counted. On the south side camera, the 8 figures had moved to within 40 meters of the main house. Petro was on the radio with the gate team. Damien's voice came from the east wing corridor, sharp, low, the voice of a man directing people who needed directing. The security panel continued its alert tone, and Elena reached over and silenced it because the sound was not information anymore, just noise. 2 minutes and 40 seconds. The figures on the south side camera stopped moving. One of them, the one at the front, the one whose posture had the specific quality of someone receiving instructions through an earpiece, put a hand up. The others held. 3 minutes. The voice came back. "Stand down is in progress," it said. "This takes 10 minutes to execute cleanly. Do not engage." "Understood," she said. "The documents," the voice said. "Stay in a file," she said, "where they remain, as long as no one gives me a reason to open it." The line went dead. She set the phone down. She sat in the monitoring room with her hands on the edge of the desk and watched the screens. 8 figures on the south grounds, holding position. Then, over the next 9 minutes, withdrawing, not running, not disordered, a trained withdrawal, back toward the south gate the way they'd come, and through it, and gone. Petro said very quietly, "They're off the grounds." Elena exhaled. It was the first full breath she had taken in 20 minutes, and it came out of her in a long, slow release that left her slightly lightheaded. The way a person got lightheaded when adrenaline stepped back and the body remembered it was a body rather than a machine. She sat for another minute. Then she stood up, straightened her clothes with the flat of her palms, and went to find Damien. I was in the East Wing corridor with 2 of his men, and the particular compressed energy of someone who had prepared for a fight and was processing the absence of it. He looked at her when she came through the door, and she could see the question in his face before he asked it. "They're gone," she said. He stared at her. "What did you do?" he said. "I made a phone call," she said. "I'll explain later. Right now I need you to get Theo out of this house and into somewhere that isn't connected to this property, because whoever I just spoke with is going to figure out within the next few hours that the leverage I used is thinner than I made it sound, and when they do, they may decide to revisit tonight's decision." Damien looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned to the 2 men and said 3 sentences, and the 2 men went back into the East Wing, and Theo Bassett, who had been sitting in the chair with the look of a man who had made the worst sequence of decisions of his life and had arrived at the end of them, was brought into the corridor, and his face when he saw Elena had in it something she did not have a clean name for, something between resignation and the particular shame of a person who had underestimated the wrong individual for a very long time. "The Delaware Company," she said to him, "all positions in the Moretti portfolio, unwound within 30 days at acquisition price. The documentation goes to Vincent Carew, and the process is completed under his supervision." Theo said nothing. "In exchange," she said, "the family does not pursue the breach of fiduciary claim through legal channels. You leave the organization. You do not contact anyone connected to the Moretti name or the Ramirez organization or Marcus Vale. You become, for all practical purposes, someone who used to work somewhere else." She held his gaze. "If you breach any part of that," she said, "the Daniel Cho file goes to every relevant party simultaneously, and you know better than I do what that means for everyone in it, including you." Theo looked at her. "You're not what anyone thought you were," he said. "Not angry, not even bitter, exactly. More like a man updating a long-held assessment and finding the update uncomfortable in the specific way that being wrong about something important was uncomfortable." "No," she said. "I'm not." He left with Damien's men at 4:50 in the morning. She watched the car leave through the front gate from the monitoring room screen, and then she turned the screens off, and the room was very quiet. The Meridian Building's title registration closed at 11:47 a.m., 58 hours and 33 minutes after Elena had made the call to the title underwriter. Inside the 72 hours, Vincent Carew sent her a text message with no words, just the registration confirmation number. She forwarded it to Damien. He did not respond for 6 minutes, and when he did, it was also wordless. Just the confirmation forwarded back to her with a single period at the end, which was the most economical expression of relief she had ever seen. The warehouse properties cleared 2 hours later. Sandra Park sent a formal administrative closure notice that Elena printed and filed in the Foundation's records, under a new tab she labeled Brancusi, Final Resolution, because she had learned a long time ago that the documentation of how things were resolved was as important as the documentation of the problems themselves, and because putting things in their proper place was how you made a record that could be trusted. The family did not celebrate. There was nothing to celebrate exactly. The house was quiet in the way it was quiet after something large had passed through it, and the people in it moved with the careful, slightly muted energy of people who were still taking inventory of what remained. Vivian stayed 3 more days. On the first of those mornings, she came to the kitchen at 6, as agreed, and Elena was there with coffee already made, and they sat across from each other at the kitchen island in the gray early light, and Vivian told her everything. She told it plainly, without the precision that Elena had come to understand was Vivian's version of self-protection. The precision she used to stay technically accurate while managing the emotional temperature of what she was saying. She told it the way a person told something when they had decided that the management was no longer worth the cost of the truth being only partially understood. She told Elena about Gerald Klein's crisis, 11 years ago, the nature of the debt, the names of the people he owed, the specific and immediate danger he had been in that Elena, at 20 years old, had not known the full dimensions of. She told her about the arrangement, about the 4.7 million, about how she had identified Elena, not through surveillance or investigation in any sinister sense, but through Gerald Klein himself, who had, in the desperation of that period, described his daughter to Vivian in the way fathers describe daughters they were frightened for, with love and helplessness, and the specific guilt of a parent who had made decisions that were going to cost his children something. She told Elena that she had watched her for 2 years before arranging the introduction to Damien, that she had not done it coercively, that Gerald Klein had not been told the terms, that he had believed the arrangement was financial, that the 4.7 million had been presented to him as a loan with flexible terms, which was technically true, that she had introduced Elena to Damien through a mutual acquaintance and had then stepped back and let whatever happened happen, because she had believed, based on everything she'd learned about Elena in 2 years of watching, that what would happen would be real. And if it hadn't been, Elena said, if Damien and I had met and felt nothing, then I would have found another way, Vivian said, to bring you into the family's orbit in a different capacity. Elena looked at her coffee cup. Because you needed what I could do, she said. Because I needed someone in this family who could do what you do, Vivian said. Yes. Damien is his father's son in many ways, brilliant at certain things, blind to others. The blindness was going to cost him eventually. I needed someone who could see what he couldn't. A pause. I did not expect you to love him. That was not part of what I planned. Elena looked up. I don't know what I feel, she said honestly. Right now I don't know. Vivian nodded. That's fair. You manipulated the circumstances of my marriage. Yes. And my father died not knowing the full truth of what he'd agreed to. Yes. The kitchen was very still. Outside the window the grounds were silver with frost, the elm trees stripped down to their winter shapes, bare and patient against the pale sky. He would have been relieved, Elena said finally. Not an absolution. She didn't have an absolution to offer, and would not have offered one if she did. Just the truth of a thing, stated plainly because plainness was what the moment could bear. He spent the last year of his life carrying something. I didn't know what it was. I know now. Vivian was quiet. I'm angry, Elena said. I want to be clear that I'm angry. At you and at what you did, and at the fact that I have to revise a significant amount of my own history with this information. She paused. But I'm also still here, and I'm still going to manage the foundation and fix the things that need fixing and make this family's legitimate business structure into something that doesn't depend on fear or on the particular patience of enemies waiting for the right fracture point. She picked up her coffee cup, not because of what you arranged, because it's what I'm good at and because leaving it undone would feel dishonest. Vivian looked at her for a long moment. I know, she said. I know that's why. I always knew that about you. They drank their coffee. The frost on the ground slowly dissolved as the morning light strengthened, and they sat in the kitchen in the particular quiet of 2 women who had arrived at something true together and were willing to let it be what it was. On the second morning, Damien came to find her in the foundation office. He knocked. He had never knocked before, had never needed to, had walked into every room in his house with the unthinking authority of ownership. But he knocked and waited, and she said, "Come in." And he came in and stood in the middle of the small room with its flat-pack furniture and its organized files and its decent lighting, and he looked like a man who had prepared something to say and had decided, somewhere between the corridor and the door, that what he'd prepared was insufficient. She waited. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what you said. That you didn't know if I would have listened, if you'd told me things earlier." "Yes." "You were right." He said it without qualification, without the management that usually accompanied admissions of error from men who were not accustomed to making them. Not because I'm a bad listener, because I had decided at some point what you were and what you weren't, and I'd stopped looking at the evidence that the decision was wrong. He paused. "I do that. I've been told I do that. I didn't believe it until I had 6 years of proof sitting in an office I didn't know existed." She looked at him steadily. "What do you want, Damien?" "I want to do better," he said. "I don't know what that looks like yet. I know it doesn't start with a speech." He looked around the office, at the filing cabinets, the organizational chart, the evidence of 18 months of quiet, uncredited work. "I want to give you the title, Official Director of Operations, Foundation and Legitimate Business Portfolio, compensation at the level the role deserves, full authority to hire, restructure, and make decisions without routing everything through me first." "That's a professional offer," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is, because I don't have the standing yet to make a personal one." She absorbed that. "Yet," she said. "Yet," he confirmed. She looked at his face, at the genuine discomfort of a man who was in unfamiliar territory and had decided to be there anyway, which was different from confidence and harder to fake. And she thought about the 6 years, and the wire transfer record, and the morning coffee with Vivian, and the 19 hours at the desk, and the phone call that had stopped 8 men on the South grounds. And she thought about what her mother had said about endurance versus weakness, and about what it meant to choose your moment rather than simply wait for it. "I'll take the title," she said. "And the authority. We'll discuss compensation separately, with Vincent Carew present, because I'm not negotiating my own professional terms with my husband in a small room without a witness." Something moved across his face that was the closest she had seen him come to a genuine, unguarded smile, surprised out of him rather than constructed. "Fair," he said. "And Damien." "Yes." "The personal offer." She held his gaze. "When you have the standing, I'll be listening." He nodded once. He left. She sat for a moment and then turned back to the foundation files, because there was still a great deal of work to do, and work had always been the most honest thing she knew. 3 weeks later, the Moretti organization held a meeting. Not a family gathering, not the kind of event with exceptional wine and careful performance, and 22 people who were primarily there to see and be seen. A working meeting in the conference room of the Meridian Building's 14th floor, with the family's remaining operational leadership and the heads of the legitimate business divisions, and Vincent Carew and 2 outside compliance consultants that Elena had brought in from a firm with no prior relationship to the Moretti name. She ran the meeting, not because Damien had stepped aside, but he was there at the table, present and engaged, but because the agenda was hers, built from 3 weeks of analysis she had conducted with the support and access she now had officially, and because it was her presentation, and she gave it. She presented the audit findings. All of them. The Carlo disbursement, the Theo positions, the structural vulnerabilities that had allowed both to go undetected for as long as they had, the 3 other irregularities she had found in the course of the full review that were smaller but symptomatic of the same underlying problem, which was that the family's legitimate business structure had been managed with the same assumption that governed the operational side, that loyalty was a substitute for oversight. It was not. She proposed a restructuring of the foundation's governance, including an independent audit committee with external members, a compliance function that reported directly to the board rather than to operational leadership, and a conflict of interest policy that covered every person with access to the family's financial information. She proposed a review of every professional relationship, legal, financial, advisory, that had been established through personal connection rather than competitive process, to be conducted over the following 6 months and resulting in a set of retained relationships that could survive scrutiny because they deserved to rather than because nobody had looked closely. She proposed, and this was the one that produced the most silence in the room, a formal separation of the foundation's governance from the family's operational interests, so that the foundation could function as a genuinely independent charitable entity rather than as a legitimizing instrument, and so that whatever the foundation accomplished could not be unwound by whatever happened on the other side of the family's affairs. The The silence after that proposal lasted long enough that she could hear the building, the distant sound of the elevator, the ambient hum of the HVAC system. Damien said, "All in favor." Every hand went up, including his. Victor Ramirez called 6 days after the meeting. He called Damien's number, but Damien handed the phone to Elena, and she took it, and she stood at the window of the study, the same window Damien had stood at on the night of the gathering, looking at the grounds lit by security lights. And she listened to what Ramirez said. He said that the Ramirez organization had no further interest in the Moretti portfolio, that the circumstances that had suggested opportunity had been, on reflection, based on information that was incomplete, that the organizations had coexisted without direct conflict for a number of years, and he saw no reason for that to change. He said one other thing, at the end, that she had not expected. He said, "The name you used, Daniel Cho. I'd like to know how you came to have it." She thought about how to answer that. Carefully, she said. A pause. "Mrs. Moretti," he said, and his voice had the quality of a man making a genuine assessment rather than a performance of one. "I've been in this business for 30 years. I've negotiated with a considerable number of people." Another pause. "I've never been stopped by a phone call before." "There's a first time for everything," she said. He laughed, genuinely, briefly, a sound that had no performance in it. "Yes," he said. "There is." The call ended. She put the phone on the desk. Damien, from the other side of the room, looked at her. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. "Mcham." The last conversation with Vivian happened on the morning of her departure, in the third-floor guest room with the east-facing window, where the winter light came in clear and clean and turned the room a particular shade of pale gold that made everything in it look more resolved than it was. Vivian was packed. Her bag was by the door, small and perfectly organized, the bag of a woman who had learned a long time ago to carry only what was necessary. She was standing at the window when Elena came in, looking out at the grounds, and she didn't turn when Elena entered, just said, "Close the door." Elena closed the door. She stood in the middle of the room. "What happens now?" Vivian said. Not to Elena specifically, more to the window, to the grounds, to whatever she was looking at. "Now I do the work," Elena said. "The foundation, the restructuring, the audit, 6 months of reviewing every professional relationship the family has." She paused. "And somewhere in the middle of that, Damien and I figure out who we are to each other when neither of us is performing." "That's the harder project," Vivian said. "I know." Vivian turned from the window. She looked at Elena with those gray eyes that had been assessing things for 68 years. People, situations, the distance between what was presented and what was true. And Elena held the look, and did not help it, and did not deflect it. "I made a decision 11 years ago," Vivian said, "that I believed was correct, and that I would make again if the circumstances were the same. I want you to know that. I'm not going to perform regret about it because that would be dishonest." She paused. "What I do regret, the only part of it, is that you weren't told. That you built 6 years of your life in a house without knowing the full terms of how you came to be in it. That was wrong. The decision was defensible. The concealment was not." Elena was quiet for a moment. "I know the difference," she said finally, "between the decision and the concealment. I've been thinking about it." She looked at the woman who had chosen her before she knew she was being chosen, who had watched her from a distance and decided she was worth the investment of a long game. And she thought about what it meant to be seen accurately, even by someone with their own agenda in the seeing. "You knew what I was capable of before I had the room to prove it. That's not nothing, even if the way you used it was wrong." Vivian absorbed that. "You're going to be formidable," she said. Not a compliment exactly, more like a fact being stated for the record. "I've always been formidable," Elena said. "It just took the right room." Vivian picked up her bag. She walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the frame and said, without turning, "Take care of him. Not because he needs it, because he's worth it. Underneath everything, that I know for certain." "I know," Elena said. Vivian left. Elena stood in the empty guest room with the east light coming through the window and the sound of Vivian's footsteps on the stairs fading below her, and she stood there long enough to feel the full weight of the last week settle into her body. The sleepless night at the desk, the phone calls, the screens in the monitoring room, The wire transfer record, the coffee in the gray kitchen mornings, all of it settling down through her like sediment finding the bottom of still water. Then she straightened. She smoothed the front of her jacket with the flat of her palm. The old habit, barely conscious anymore. The gesture of a woman preparing to be exactly where she was. And she walked out of the guest room and down the stairs and through the house that she had been placed in before she knew it existed, and that she had made her own anyway. Not because of who had brought her there, but because of what she had built inside it, quietly, without asking for recognition, in the spaces between the things that were supposed to matter. The Moretti Foundation's annual report, published 4 months later, listed a new director of operations for the first time in the foundation's history. The report ran to 60 pages. It documented $4.8 million in community grants, 12 program partnerships across 5 boroughs, and a complete structural audit resulting in a new governance framework that had been reviewed and certified by an independent compliance firm. It also documented, in a brief section near the back that most people would not read carefully, the cancellation of 6 irregular grant disbursements identified during the audit review period, the return of the relevant funds to the Foundation's general account, and the implementation of an oversight protocol designed to prevent recurrence. The report did not name Carlo. It did not name Theo. It did not describe the night of the gathering or the 19 hours at the desk or the 8 men on the south grounds or the phone call that had stopped them. It didn't need to. What it described was the result, which was a family's legitimate foundation, functional, clean, properly governed, and positioned to do the work it had always claimed to do. Elena read the final proof at the desk in her office. The small room that had been a storage room and that now had proper furniture and adequate lighting, and a plaque beside the door that read Office of the Director of Operations in plain, unornamented type. And she read it the way she read everything, carefully, checking each figure against her memory of the source material, making sure what was recorded was accurate rather than flattering. It was accurate. She approved the proof. She sent it to the printer. She sat for a moment in the quiet of the office, in the house that had been built on the assumption that power was the loudest thing in any room and that money was the measure of a person's worth. And she listened to the building around her, to the distant sound of Damien on the phone in the study, to Rosaria in the kitchen below, to the ordinary sounds of a house where people lived and worked and made decisions about who they were going to be. And she thought about nothing in particular, which was its own kind of luxury. The luxury of a person who had done what needed to be done and did not need to rehearse it. Outside, the first snow of the year had begun. It fell on the grounds in the early dark of a November evening, soft and without drama, covering the stone path and the elm trees and the south gate and everything else equally, the way that time covered things. Not erasing them, just changing their surface, making them look, for a little while, like something new. She watched it from the office window until the light was gone. Then she turned on her desk lamp and opened the next file and went back to work.